In today's video, we're going to discuss the difference between primary and secondary sources. Understanding the difference between these sources is important in all manners of research, but is especially vital to historical research. A person who pieces together information gathered from primary and secondary sources about any given historical topic is known as a historian. Historians use their research to write a thesis statement and then support that statement with evidence gathered from the two types of sources.
For today's topic, let's start with primary sources. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of a topic from people who had a direct connection with it, meaning they were either present for the event or lived during the time in which it took place. The autobiography of World War II veteran Eugene Sledge is a great example. Mr. Sledge not only fought in the war, but kept a running list of his activities. Although he waited 40 years to write his memoir, his account of the war in the Pacific during World War II is a primary source because he lived through the event. Primary sources can take unlimited forms. Some examples of primary documents are speeches, diaries, letters, newspapers, and even original documents such as laws, photographs, or plays. As technology advances, so do primary documents. More recent examples would be audio recordings, emails, text messages, social media platforms, and videos like this one. In addition, primary documents can also be artifacts from a particular time period. Examples of artifacts can be pretty much anything. Articles of clothing, works of art, furniture, really anything and everything you see around you. Secondary sources are not considered the complete opposite of primary sources, but rather build off of primary source material. A secondary source covers a particular topic using interpretation and analysis of primary sources. Some great examples of secondary sources would be textbooks, scholarly journals, or biographies. Secondary sources are the defense of conclusions drawn by historians who have conducted quality research using many primary and sometimes even other secondary sources.
So you might be thinking, aren't all sources primary because they are representative of the time in which they were created? Yes, all sources are primary, but not all sources are secondary. In order to be secondary, it must be written by someone who did not live through the topic, but is conducting research and drawing their own conclusions. So what does all this mean for you when approaching a text? What are some of the questions you should be asking each time you approach a source?
First, who is the author and when was this written? Knowing who created the source and when allows you to gain a better understanding about the type of information you can expect about the historical topic being researched. Because humans all have a unique perspective made up of our varying backgrounds, beliefs, locations, etc., anything humans produce will be skewed based on that perspective. It is important to recognize the perspective of the author, the perspective of the times in which it was written, and your own perspective when approaching primary and secondary sources. Second question, do I have enough sources from both types? It can be extremely problematic if you have too little or too many of one or the other type of source. For example, if I'm doing research on the experience of World War II soldiers, then the autobiography of Eugene Sledge is a great resource. But if that's the only source I'm using, then I'm missing the perspective of the entire European theater of the war. In addition, without a secondary source, I miss out on the many years of scholarship and research conducted by other historians. Conversely, if I only use a secondary source, then all my information about the perspective of soldiers is coming from people who weren't actually living through World War II. It is vital to ensure that you have a good balance of both primary and secondary sources when available. This brings us to our third and final question. How can I help preserve and create quality sources? As you may notice, the further back in time your research topic goes, the fewer primary sources there are at your disposal. It could be that sources have been destroyed or weathered, or they are privately owned and therefore unavailable to you. One positive is that globalization and the internet does allow us access to a mountain of primary and secondary sources at any time. However, we should begin to think of ourselves as purveyors of sources and seek to protect the important artifacts and documents all around us. We should also be mindful that our research and theses matter in the analytical discussions and memory of and about the past. Always remember, conducting quality research won't just get you a great grade, but it aids in the preservation of our history.